What if the perfect life was a lie? Imagine a childhood of privilege, growing up in the sun-drenched paradise of Newport Beach, California. Private schools, wealthy families, a future gleaming with promise. This was the world Carolyn Francis was born into. But at the age of 11, a single act of betrayal shattered that illusion, setting her on a path no one could have predicted. From that moment, a shadow fell over her. The happy girl with perfect grades disappeared, replaced by someone fighting to numb a pain no one else could see. Her journey would spiral through the hedonistic highs of California's surf culture, into the grim underworld of addiction, and down to a makeshift shack behind a fish market. She would lose everything, her family, her home, even herself, all while clinging to one devastating secret, a love for her children that her addictions seemed determined to destroy. This is not just a story about heroin. This is a story about trauma, survival, and the haunting question: when the world stops believing you, what do you become? This is Caroline's truth. If you're intrigued by stories of real human resilience, the kind that doesn't shy away from the darkest corners of experience, then you're in the right place. We dive deep into lives like Caroline's to understand the why behind the struggle. If that's something you want more of, help our channel grow. Hit that like button, subscribe, and if you know someone who should hear this story, please share it. Your support lets us keep bringing these important narratives to light. To understand the end of Caroline's story, you have to see the beginning. And it began not in a gutter, but in the gleaming, privileged enclave of Newport Beach, California. Picture it: pristine beaches, manicured lawns, a life of sailboats and private schools. Caroline Francis was born to Bob and Bernice Francis, a girl raised in the heart of the American dream. They moved from Santa Ana to Fountain Valley, settling into a world where futures were preordained for success. She attended Liberty Christian School, a name that promised moral fortitude alongside academic rigor. From the outside, it was a perfect shell, a glossy, impenetrable shell. But what happens when the crack comes from inside? That crack had a name: Douglas Whitney. In the 5th grade, Caroline was abused. The trauma didn't end in a single moment. It bled across years, from 5th grade through 8th, a constant private hell she was forced to endure. Why? Because her abuser's children went to the same school. Her parents, believing in justice, went to the police. A lie detector test was administered, and he failed. Yet, in the insular world of wealthy families protecting their own, the result was ignored. For 15 years, the truth was buried. Caroline wasn't believed. She was seen as a liar, a problem, a girl making up stories about a respected man. Can you imagine the seismic shift that causes in a child's soul? The world you're told is safe and just suddenly reveals itself as a colluding facade. I had perfect grades, she recalls. My grades continued to be good, but something happened to me after that. Something changed inside me, and I was never the same again. The excellent student remained, but the happy girl vanished. She navigated the halls of her school as a social pariah, uninvited to parties, looked at with scornful eyes. The message was clear: your truth is inconvenient. Your pain is not our problem. The shell of her perfect life wasn't just cracked, it was hollowed out. This chapter isn't about the act of abuse itself, but about the betrayal that followed. It's about the theft of her faith in authority, in community, in the very systems meant to protect her. The trauma was one wound. The systematic dismissal of her pain was another, deeper one. It planted a seed of profound dislocation, a feeling that she was fundamentally alone in her reality, that when she screamed, no sound would ever be heard. This silent, screaming isolation became the fertile ground where every bad decision that followed would take root. The bright California sun still shone on Newport Beach, but for Carolyn, the internal landscape had already turned cold and dark. The search for something, anything, to fill that void was about to begin. So what do you do with that kind of hurt? When the world tells you your pain is a fiction, a part of you might start to believe it. Or worse, you might decide that if your pain doesn't matter, then you don't matter either. For Caroline, the carefully constructed shell of the good girl was now a prison. The pressure to be normal, to perform, to keep getting those good grades while screaming inside, it had to find a release valve. And so she describes a deliberate, almost defiant unraveling. I became promiscuous, she states plainly. It wasn't about sex, not at first. It was about agency, however distorted. It was about reclaiming a body and a narrative that had been stolen from her, even if the reclamation was self-destructive. She drew lines. I didn't have sex until I was 17, but lived in the blurred spaces around them, a teenager screaming into the void through risky behavior. The void, as it often does, answered back with a dangerous kind of magnetism. At 17, she met a man a decade older, one of the owners of the surf brand Billabong. He was 27, successful, and lived in a gigantic beach house in Huntington Beach. To a traumatized teenager, he wasn't just a boyfriend, he was an escape pod. He represented a new, edgy, adult world far from the stifling judgment of her past. And this world came with a key, cocaine. It started socially, little by little, snorting lines with professional surfers, drawn into a circle that seemed glamorous and free. For a girl who felt everything too deeply, here was a substance that promised the opposite: clarity, energy, a numbing euphoria. It was the perfect counter to the heavy, numb despair she carried. But addiction is a progressive science, and the body always builds a tolerance. The escape needed to be deeper, stronger. Cocaine led to methamphetamine. And here, the story takes a darker, more tragic turn. She watched the man she loved, this seemingly successful entrepreneur, succumb to the drug's vicious grip. He lost everything little by little, she recalls. He sold Billabong, lost the next company he founded, and their relationship crumbled under the weight of addiction. Caroline loved him, was even engaged to him, and his collapse was another profound loss. It was a brutal lesson. The escape pods offered by this world were faulty. They didn't lead to safety. They led to free fall. The breakup shattered her. I didn't eat anything for a month, and I wasn't the same after that. The promiscuity returned, now mixed with the deeper, more relentless drinking habit. It was as if the meth had burned away the last of her emotional buffers. The trauma of her childhood, the fresh wound of a broken engagement, the gnawing existential pain. It all flooded back, louder and more urgent than before. She was adrift, self-medicating with sex and alcohol, trying to outrun a shadow that was now part of her own silhouette. The unraveling was no longer just behavioral, it was existential. She was a puzzle taken apart, and the pieces no longer fit the picture of the life she was supposed to have. The search for something to put her back together was about to get even more desperate. If the previous relationships were about escape, the next one would become a master class in confusion. Enter a figure known in the media as Charlie Sheen. Introduced by a friend, Carolyn thought she was simply going on dates. She had no idea her friend was being paid, that in the shadows this was a transaction. But Charlie's approach was disorienting. He never treated her like a prostitute, she insists. He treated her like a friend. The money came in the form of checks written for charity, sometimes for thousands of dollars, handed over in an office. It was a relationship built in a hall of mirrors, where nothing was what it seemed. For Carolyn, isolated and seeking validation, was this kindness or a more sophisticated form of exploitation? The line vanished. He was, she says, very good to me. He taught me a lot. But what was the lesson? That her company had a price, even if it was called a donation? This bizarre entanglement became the backdrop for the single most devastating loss of her life. Her brother Tom, a lieutenant in the United States Navy, a fighter pilot, was killed in a training accident. The news arrived with a terrifying cinematic horror. Two officers at the door, seen through the glass, a moment frozen in dread. Her mother had to gather the strength to open it. The official notification: presumed dead, lost at sea. They couldn't even recover his body for a burial. The foundation of her family, already strained, was shattered. In the face of this cosmic-scale grief, what could possibly be an adequate response? Charlie's answer was to take her to Costa Rica, and their method of coping was a frantic, suicidal attempt to outrun sorrow. They consumed an insane amount of cocaine. She describes arriving, stumbling out of a limousine so loaded they could barely function. It wasn't even funny, she says. She spent most of the trip unconscious from alcohol, a blackout attempting to blot out a reality too painful to bear. Think about that image. A luxury vacation in paradise, funded by ambiguous checks, serving as the stage for a twin collapse into grief and addiction. It's here we see the horrible synergy of her life. Trauma and chemical escape were now locked in a feedback loop, each amplifying the other. The void wasn't just being chased, it was being fed. In the aftermath, the attempt at normalcy continued, but the center could not hold. She joined Alcoholics Anonymous. It didn't help. She moved in with another boyfriend, and her drinking increased little by little. She was trying, in her way, to climb out. But the pull of the void was gravitational. Every emotional pain, the childhood betrayal, the lost love, the piercing grief for her brother, had become a physical ache, a screaming nerve that only one thing seemed to silence: more. More alcohol, more cocaine, more of anything that could flatten the world into something bearable for a single, fleeting hour. She was a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, and the next step she would take wasn't a step down, but a leap into the abyss she thought she could control. The haunting question at the heart of Caroline's relationship with Charlie Shinn isn't just about what he was buying, but what she was selling, and more importantly, what she believed she was worth. In the chaotic freefall after her brother's death, Charlie presented a bizarre form of stability. He wasn't a boyfriend in any traditional sense, yet he provided a safety net, woven from cash and casual companionship. The checks written for charity were a fiction they both consciously upheld, a delicate lie that allowed Caroline to accept the money without fully confronting what it meant. For a woman whose self-worth had been systematically dismantled since childhood, this ambiguous arrangement created a dangerous, new internal logic. Her value was quantifiable, and her companionship could be traded for survival. It wasn't prostitution in a back alley, it was a gilded dependency. Caroline remains fiercely defensive of him, pushing back against media narratives. "I know because I spent enough time with him," she says. "They say he hits. He just keeps his distance." I don't believe any of those stories. This defense is crucial to understanding her psychology. To admit Charlie was exploitative would be to admit she was a victim, again. It would shatter the one narrative where she had some semblance of control and care. By framing him as a misunderstood benefactor, she protects the integrity of that fragile lifeline. He was, in her eyes, the one person who didn't ask her to be the nice little girl from Newport Beach, and who paid her the compliment of treating her like a complicated adult, even as he kept her financially bound. But this lifeline was also a leash, and it kept her tethered to a world of escalating drug use. Their trip to Costa Rica, a blur of cocaine and unconsciousness, was the ultimate testament to a relationship built on mutual avoidance. He avoided the reality of what he was doing. She avoided the reality of her grief. He became the financier of her oblivion. In this sense, he wasn't a savior, but an enabler on a grand scale, providing the resources for her to dive deeper into addiction under the guise of care or charity. The money that paid for rent and groceries also paid for the drugs that allowed her to forget why she needed the help in the first place. When this relationship eventually ended, as all transactional relationships do, the fallout was catastrophic. The financial support vanished, but the addiction it had subsidized remained, now a ravenous, independent entity. The coping mechanism was gone, but the pain it was meant to cope with was sharper than ever. She was left with the shattered pieces of her dignity and a habit she could no longer afford. This is the true cost of the gentleman and the check. It wasn't just about the money, it was about postponing the inevitable confrontation with her own demons. When the check stopped, she was left alone with them in a dark room, with only one known way to make them be quiet. The search for that quiet would now take her to a place her father had specifically warned her about, the world of heroin. Amidst the chaos, a profound contradiction took root. Caroline became a mother. She reconnected with a kind man named Darren, the father of her daughter, Keela. He was, she says, very kind to me and tried to help me as much as he could. For a time, there was a fragile stability. They moved to Ramirez Canyon, and Caroline gave birth to a baby girl. This wasn't the life of a homeless addict. This was the life of a working mother. She got her esthetician's license and built a successful career providing a good home. From the outside, it might have looked like a redemption arc, but inside, the old pain and the new pressures of motherhood created a storm that her previous coping mechanisms couldn't weather. Alcohol, her constant companion, became a more insistent crutch. This chapter of her life was a masterclass in duality, a split-screen existence. By day she was Caroline the esthetician, the attentive mom. I attended parent-teacher meetings. I went to everything. I never stopped doing things, she recounts. She loved Keela fiercely, but by night or in stolen moments, the shadow self took over. Her alcoholism deepened, a little-by-little creep that became a flood. She describes a year and a half where her drinking reached much worse levels, a secret tide rising within the walls of their home. It was a Jekyll and Hyde performance where the loving, present mother and the woman fleeing herself existed in the same body in a desperate, exhausting rotation. The breaking point came from within the shadow. Through a friend named Belinda, she was introduced to a drug that had always been her personal line in the sand: heroin. Her father had warned her about it, a forbidden word in her life. But watching Belinda smoke it, functional, alert, cleaning her house, shattered her preconceptions. It didn't look like collapse, it looked like control. And in a moment of catastrophic curiosity, alone after Belinda left, Caroline tried it. The effect was instant and profound. I no longer felt the abuse. I didn't feel the death of my brother. I didn't feel anything at all. I just felt that everything was going to be all right. For a woman carrying lifetimes of unspeakable feeling, this was not just a high, it was a miracle cure. And so, the split-screen existence reached its terrifying apex. Now she was a career woman, a soccer mom, and a heroin addict. She maintained her facade with military precision. Her ritual was hidden in the laundry room of her nice home in Calabasas, where she would unscrew a light fixture to deter anyone from entering. That was my spot, she says. She would buy $100 worth of heroin a day, drive to Topanga Canyon, and return to her life, her secret tucked away. Nobody knew, not even the cleaning lady. But addiction is a truth-teller. The love for her daughter was real, but the drug's grip was realer. The carefully managed double life was a house of cards, and the tremors of her hidden reality were already beginning to shake it apart. There's a moment in every addiction story that becomes a haunting landmark, a before and an after. For Caroline, before was a life of pain, managed by alcohol, cocaine, and a fragile double life. After began on a couch in Calabasas, with a piece of aluminum foil and a drug she had sworn she would never touch. But addiction never crosses a line you're standing guard over. It waits until you turn your back, until your defenses are exhausted. Hers were obliterated. Watching her friend Belinda smoke heroin functionally shattered a lifetime of warnings. If heroin didn't mean nodding out in alleyways, then what was it? The question itself became a dangerous opening. Her first attempt was an act of solitary defiance. She waited until Belinda left, then tried it herself. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. In her own words, the effect was a total erasure. I no longer felt the abuse I had suffered at school during my childhood. I didn't feel the relationships that had ended, nor did I feel the death of my brother. I didn't feel anything at all. Consider the power of that statement. For over 2 decades, every waking moment had been filtered through the pain of betrayal, loss, and grief. Heroin in one breath didn't just mute that noise, it switched the channel to static. The constant screaming narrative in her head finally went silent. What she felt wasn't just a high, it was peace. This is the sinister genius of opiates, especially for the traumatized. They don't just make you feel good, they make you feel nothing, which to someone in relentless emotional agony feels like salvation. Alcohol and cocaine had been attempts to outrun the pain, to amplify herself, to drown it out. Heroin was different. It was a gentle, warm, definitive off-switch. I just felt that everything was going to be all right, she says. And in that moment, the psychological trap was sprung. Why would anyone ever choose to feel the crushing weight of their life again when they could simply choose to feel all right? The descent from that first hit wasn't a slide. It was a gravitational pull. The next day I started buying, just like that. She became the means for Belinda and her husband to get their heroin, and soon found her own dealer in Topanga Canyon. A $100 a day ritual was seamlessly grafted onto her existing life. She was now a full-time mother, a professional, and a full-time heroin addict, compartmentalizing each role with terrifying efficiency. The drug that promised to make everything all right had, in a single day, become the central, organizing principle of her existence. The house of cards in Calabasas was still standing, but the foundation was now made of smoke. Every double life has an expiration date. For Carolyn, the end of her carefully managed facade came not with a dramatic intervention, but with a practical crisis. Her dealer in Topanga Canyon got busted. Suddenly, the logistical machinery of her addiction broke down. The stable, hidden ritual was over. This is a critical juncture in any addiction story, when the sustainable, controlled habit becomes unsustainable and chaos takes the wheel. She scrambled, finding a new dealer named Scooter, a woman in a wheelchair in San Julian. Now her procurement required a daily drive in her BMW truck to a sidewalk transaction, a stark and risky departure from her previous discreet routine. The veneer was cracking. The final crack became a chasm when her partner, Jeff, discovered her secret. Her daughter Keela's father was told, and the decision was made. Keela would stay with him while Caroline went to rehab. It was a logical, caring plan. But plans require a self that wants to be saved. Caroline took the first part. She let her daughter go, but rejected the second. I never went to rehab, she admits. Instead, she stayed alone and began a new, rootless existence living in hotels, one after the other, using the last of her money to fund her isolation and her habit. The structure of family life, the reason to maintain appearances, was gone. What remained was the uncomplicated, singular purpose of the drug. Money, of course, runs out. And when it did, Caroline faced the calculus of desperation. She had already lost her home, her daughter, and her stability. The only thing left to trade was herself. The idea of being a prostitute had never crossed my mind, she says, but at that moment I thought, well, this could be possible. The decision is stated with a chilling matter-of-factness. She bought condoms and went out. The first car that picked her up, an undercover police officer. The surreal humiliation of that moment, being entrapped by the very system that failed to protect her as a child, underscores the grotesque circus her life had become. She was now officially in the underworld. This chapter marks the complete inversion of her world. The woman from Newport Beach, the esthetician from Calabasas, was now a homeless sex worker, navigating a landscape of danger and deception to buy heroin. She references other crazy deceptions and violent men. The shell she once hid her pain within was now entirely gone, replaced by the literal, exposed reality of life on the streets. The descent was complete. She had traded a hidden laundry room for a squalid shack, a BMW for a sidewalk, and the respectability of motherhood for the survival tactics of the hunted. The drug that promised to make everything all right had delivered her to a place where nothing was. The bottom, when you hit it, has its own bizarre community and rules. For Caroline, this was a squat, a makeshift shack of plywood and cardboard hidden behind a fish market. She shared this cramped space with others, sleeping on a shelf, a literal bunk bed of survival. This was a far cry from the beach houses and luxury hotels of her past. This was raw, exposed existence. Here, relationships were transactional and fleeting, governed by the need for the next fix. She describes a man who slept with several of the women there, a dynamic of casual exploitation that was just part of the landscape. In this world, her past was irrelevant. She was no longer Caroline from Newport Beach. She was just another person in the shack, defined solely by her addiction and her ability to secure the next dose. It was in this environment, while on a methadone program in a last-gasp attempt at stability, that she discovered she was pregnant again. The father was a man from this transient world, someone she says was always making fun of me and lying to her. The pregnancy should have been a final urgent reason to cling to the methadone treatment, but the gravitational pull of her trauma and addiction proved stronger. Faced with the overwhelming fear and reality of carrying a child in these circumstances, she made what she calls the worst thing I've ever done. She relapsed, going back to heroin while pregnant. The drug that numbed her pain now actively threatened an innocent life, a contradiction so profound it would haunt her forever. The guilt from this decision is the sharpest, most unrelenting pain she carries. I did that to a baby, and to this day I still haven't been able to forgive myself, she admits, her voice heavy with a regret that seems to physically weigh her down. She gave birth to a son, Charlie, and the immediate aftermath was a new kind of torture, waiting to see if her actions had caused him permanent harm. Luckily, he doesn't have any problems, she says, clinging to this piece of grace. But the relief is tempered by a crushing self-loathing. Her response to this ultimate maternal failure was to decide to never risk it again, to get her tubes tied. It was a surgical acknowledgement of a brutal truth. She could not trust herself to be responsible for another life. In the wreckage, a fragile arrangement was made. Her mother, a serious and straightforward woman, took custody of baby Charlie. Caroline clings to the cold comfort offered by her mother, that because she smoked heroin instead of injecting it, the damage to Charlie was less severe. It's a grim asterisk on a tragic event. Meanwhile, her older daughter, Keela, remained with her father. Caroline now exists in a painful limbo. Her children are safe, cared for by others, but she is separated from them by the very addiction she used to silence the pains of her own childhood. The cycle feels terrifyingly complete. The little girl who wasn't protected now cannot protect her own children, her love for them trapped behind the same impenetrable wall of her need. When there are no more excuses, no more hiding places, and no more escapes, all that's left is the truth. This chapter is Caroline's reckoning, not with the law or society, but with herself and the two children whose lives are forever entwined with her addiction. Speaking directly to the camera, and thus to Keela and Charlie in some imagined future, her voice shifts from storytelling to confession. I pray in God's name that you never follow my path, she says, her wish for them a painful mirror of her own father's warning she failed to heed. Her message is a desperate blueprint for the life she couldn't give them. Listen to your grandmother, go to university, find good people, have a good life. It's a list of normalcies that feel like a foreign country to her, offered up as a prayer. The most poignant, gut-wrenching part of her plea is the acknowledgement of the void her absence creates. I hope you don't end up with someone who isn't good for you at all because you didn't have your mother during this time, she tells Keela, understanding that her addiction doesn't just affect her. It shapes her children's futures, their templates for love and security. She pins her hopes on therapy, on her mother's steadfastness, on the idea that they can process this abandonment. But then she circles the central, agonizing contradiction. I swear I tried. I did everything to try to win her back and be with her again. But the truth is, I have a heroin addiction. In one breath, she claims agency and effort. In the next, she confesses to its ultimate futility against the drug's power. Her love for them is real, and she fights for its recognition, pleading with Keela to remember the good times, the smoothies, the salads, the clothes, the hugs. It's a mother's attempt to assert that her identity is not solely defined by her worst moments. Yet, in the same thought, she returns to the addiction with a clarity that borders on the clinical. This drug is very addictive. It's not any less bad for smoking it. It's the same garbage. She offers no more rationalizations. The drug is garbage. She is addicted to garbage, and she knows her children might one day see all of this. The chapter closes not with a promise of imminent recovery, but with a stark assessment of the battlefield. I know I can recover and quit someday. I'll overcome it. I have to. But it's taking me some time. There is hope here, but it's weary and distant. The immediate reality is the grip of the addiction and the crushing weight of her guilt, particularly toward baby Charlie. If I did anything that hurt you in any way, I assure you it wasn't with the intention of hurting you, she tells him, a statement that captures the tragic heart of her entire story. The road to hell, paved not with malice, but with fractured intentions and a pain so deep it sought annihilation even at the cost of everything she loved. Caroline's story is not an island. It's a stark peninsula connected to the mainland of human experience by a bridge of trauma and unmet need. We watch her journey from the privileged child to the homeless addict, and it's easy to frame it as a simple morality tale, a series of bad choices. But that's a comforting lie. The harder, more truthful lens reveals a cascade of systemic and personal failures. A community that chose silence over a child's safety. A justice system that provided a result, but no resolution. A grief that was met with powder instead of support. Her addiction wasn't the cause of her downfall. It was the symptom, the final self-administered medication for wounds that were inflicted years before the first hit. So what do we, the audience, carry away from this? First, a challenge to our judgment. It's human nature to look at someone like Caroline on the street and reduce her to a statistic, a warning, a junkie. Her narrative forces us to ask, what is the function of the addiction? For her, heroin had a job. It was the foreman of emotional demolition, the only thing that could silence the internal wrecking ball of memory. Understanding this doesn't excuse the devastation, but it reframes it from a character flaw to a catastrophic coping mechanism. It asks us to see the person before the pathology. Her final pleading message to her children holds the fragile seed of a different future. In begging them not to follow her path, in urging them toward education and stability, she is trying to wield the one form of agency she has left, the power to define the legacy of her pain. She is attempting to transform her experience from an inherited curse into a learned lesson for them. It's the most profound act of love she can muster from within her prison. Whether that message can penetrate the hurt her absence caused is the unresolved question that hangs over their lives. Caroline's story doesn't end with a clean redemption. It ends with a woman in the midst of a long, hard war, acknowledging the enemy within. I'll overcome it. I have to. This isn't a triumphant declaration, but a weary commitment to a fight she knows she can't afford to lose. Her journey forces us to sit with a difficult truth. Some battles are lifelong, and recovery is less a destination and more a direction. Her testimony, in all its raw, uncomfortable honesty, is a flashlight shown into the dark logic of addiction. It doesn't promise a happy ending, but it offers something perhaps more valuable: understanding. And in understanding, we find the first crucial step toward compassion, for her and for the countless others carrying similar invisible weight.